But I look at these very like self-aggrandizing, outward facing views, or outward facing like people who sort of espouse these types of behaviors. The interesting thing about you is like, yeah, dude, under a barbell, you're still a really dangerous guy, right? Like, how do you deal with now entering in from, and I hate to maybe bring up the content space, but like the community that you attract is going to be as a byproduct of that, right? I remember when we would discuss powerlifting and you would be like, don't you know who this guy is? He was like the first, what was the guy's name? It's how bad it is. He was like the first guy that did powerlifting coaching on YouTube. And I was like, I have no idea who that is, dog. How have you dealt with like, I'm trying to think of his fucking name.
You're probably talking about Mike Toucher. I was probably mentioning, because he was the first like legit powerlifting coach online. He's the only one who beat me and like a couple others.
Candido, the Johnny Candido.
Oh, Candido.
Is that a name?
Yeah, Candido is one
sure.
of those.
Okay, so like now, as your content evolves to just be like, hey, this is what I do. I'm the niche. This is the stuff I like. Undoubtedly, you're going to get pulled into somewhat of an algorithm, and now you're going to start getting shown the other people that are talking about this with maybe ulterior motives, maybe bad incentives. What are like red flags if someone is looking to be like, hey, I'm super angry. I like to lift, but also maybe don't want to just be this like, sagittal plane tin man with emotional tin feelings. Like, what are like the biggest red flags as you've dove into this? You're like, yo, if they start talking this stuff, if you start lighting your feet on fire, I don't know what the fucking people get up to. Like, what have you noticed of like, oh, wait a minute, this is like pretty bad practice in this world?
Yeah, dude, there's a lot of that because admittedly, I think most people get into these practices from a state of chaos in their life. Like that is what I was in. And so if you're not really careful, because I should explain too real quick how meditation actually works, because a lot of these people go through the practices, take them serious. And really what you're doing is they consider it in the cog sci world, disruptive patterns to the neural mechanism. So basically like our first 15 to 23-ish years of life, we're kind of a blank slate and our brain is an efficiency machine. So in order to like know how to do anything without having to waste energy and think about it, it's going to pattern behavior after behavior. It's unanimously agreed upon right now by most cognitive scientists that somewhere between 95 to 99% of all human action is autonomous. It's unconscious. It's not something you decide on. Free will is more of an illusion and kind of a learned pattern from previous experience. So we can get into that because I see your face. But what I'm saying, though, is meditation disrupts these patterns. So really the practice of like the basic meditation you'd start up with is you sit and focus on the breath and you don't let thoughts come in. Inevitably, thoughts are going to come in. Every time the mind wanders, you bring the mind back to center. When you've done that, it's like doing a rep in the gym. It's like training your bicep for like one rep. And if you do this over and over again, what you'll find is you become aware that the brain, you're catching it going down these like patterns that it's kind of learned through life. And then when you start to unravel this simply by bringing awareness to this, what they find is it disrupts the neural mechanism. And then it allows you to like reappropriate like a new way of seeing the world, a new perspective. There's actually this famous problem called the 9-dot problem. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So it's basically you just draw these 9 dots in a pattern of a square and you tell people to connect the dots with 4 straight lines. And that's all they have to do. No other rules. Almost no one can do it their first time. And the reason why is because we've been conditioned as a society to see it in the shape of a square. And the answer is to actually go outside of the box. You just draw the line past the perimeter of the box and you can easily connect all the dots with 4 straight lines, but you can't do it without going outside the box. This is where think outside the box literally came from, the science experiment. And so the reason we can't see that is because of learned patterns. Meditation disrupts that. So what they do find with that test is people who are autistic or with Asperger's or highly practiced meditators, they can usually solve it a lot easier than someone who's just kind of living in their state of conditioning. So basically what ends up happening, just to get this back to your original point, you have these people who like reapproach their life. And I think they're like legitimately doing this and they dissolve all these like learned behaviors. and then they start to reapproach. But the problem is the goal is to kind of dissolve your ego. It's to at least minimize it. You're not going to completely get rid of it, but your goal is like ego dissolution. It's like to remove this idea of like me, which removes self-centeredness and allows you to be more effective in the world, because you stop thinking about just yourself and you start thinking about the greater effect of your actions. But the problem is once you start removing all those pathways, you start to replace them with other things. And the first thing a lot of spiritual people do, the Austin, Texas people, is they start to create a spiritual identity. And so they become these enlightened beings. And this is actually like a well-documented problem. There's this dude who went off to India, became like enlightened, and even had like a legit guru who taught him these practices for years, kind of ordained him as a practitioner. He came back and was like heavily abusing people. He was like basically using his power to like do really fucked up shit. Like the stories are out there, and there's endless of these stories. So it's like anything, man. When humans get involved to a high degree, there's a lot of BS. What I would say is the number one thing that's a red flag is, does someone seem like they're being something? Like, I know that's kind of broad, but like if you see a person there, like if you kind of see a personality, that's actually a good thing, which is ironic because a lot of these people approach it like, oh, I'm this enlightened being and there is no Brendan here. And I'm like, I can show you how to get rid of all your emotions. Like, I still feel angry oftentimes in life, but the difference is I'm able to catch it. So it's not really like you completely change. It's just more your awareness changes, and you have to look out for like the people who are acting kind of grandois and just, they're bullshit.
But yeah, there's that one guy who's like kind of been made, but no one really cared. That Chetty guy, isn't he full of shit? Isn't that guy who's like, I don't know if you know him. He's like a popular podcaster. I'm to understand that he's been like entirely debunked, but that people don't care.
No, I haven't caught it. There's like legit, you do have to be careful. I haven't seen that one. I actually stay out of that space. Like, I don't pay attention to it much. I actually try to stay in the realms of academia. That's why you'll hear me mention John Vervaeke and some of these other scientists that I follow a lot, because they're the only ones that I think are grounded, but they're still approaching this with a less materialistic worldview. They're trying to figure out what's actually going on without being dogmatic and completely like closed off to these like Eastern practices. And it's because most of these people have their own stories about how it changed their lives. And so they're trying to research and understand what's been happening with themselves. So honestly, if you want some like really practical advice, follow people who are practicing this stuff that are either involved in academia or aware of what's going on there. Like, clearly I didn't go and get my PhD in philosophy or in like cog sci, although I am thinking about going to get it now, which is kind of nuts to say. But it's one of those things where I would probably stay more in those realms because it's going to be a lot more grounded.
Now, again, thinking laterally to the only thing that my one-dimensional ass really knows about, and that's training. I know a ton of people that when the research sways, their practices sway. Now, it sounds like these things aren't as, rolling with the tides. Fundamentally, it seems like the science is probably a little bit more maybe clear-cut, if that's safe to say. But how do you appraise, now obviously the researcher seems to be maybe the underlying answer to this, but how do you appraise knowing like kind of what works for you, almost like in an anecdotal training sense? Like, I know X, Y, and Z instinctively works for me, so I'm going to keep doing it, versus like, all right, well, because it seems like there's a lot, as like an uneducated outsider who's just trying to keep his head on straight. It's like, it looks like almost like a daunting task. And I did an episode the other day about like appraising content creators and research in the fitness space. What do you look for as far as like, I don't know, the research came out on like this particular practice, but I don't know, maybe like I'm not going to shine fucking sunshine up my asshole because my neighbors might feel a type of way about that. Like where's the line?
Yeah. I'm definitely not doing any taint sunning like with my neighbors out in the yards or anything, but so first off, again, I always do this, so I apologize, but I'm going to back up just a little bit. Basically, I look for the 4 Ps whenever I'm examining like what to follow. So in cog sci, there's these 4 Ps. And it's kind of a reappropriation of, if you've ever heard of the 4 ways of knowing by the Greeks. They had like techne, episteme, like it's where epistemology comes from. And they kind of coined these 4 ways you can know something. And in cog sci, they have the 4 Ps. Procedural, which is like, I know through doing. So if I throw a baseball, I know by throwing a baseball, not by reading it in a book. There's propositional, which is kind of theoretical intellect. This is like, Paris is in France, or like, it's like something that that's kind of unanimously agreed upon by intellect. There's perspectival, which is kind of a consciousness based. Like, I grew up in World War II Nazi Germany, so I know what it's like to grow up in World War II Nazi Germany, and people who have not grown up there don't. So that's perspectival. And then there's propositional, or excuse me, I already said that one. There is participatory. So participatory knowing, it has to do with what's called an agent arena relationship, which is essentially like integrating into life and understanding the rules of life. The reason they call it agent arena is like, it's someone who enters a football stadium knows the rules of football, and therefore they know how to integrate into the game, and they can participate and like deeply connect to the game. But if someone doesn't know how to play football, they're not going to be able to integrate. So you know through participation. And I think whenever you're examining what to do with a meditation practice, I wouldn't even just look at academia, even though I'm saying to stay grounded there from content creators. I would look in these other areas. So I would go to, you actually touched on this recently about, I think it was like bodybuilding or influencers, but like the guy who did 30 years of bodybuilding, even if he doesn't know a thing about science, probably knows something about bodybuilding. You should listen to a little bit of it at minimum. So that experiential knowing, right? And then I would also go into that propositional. I would look at the latest science, but you want a body of literature, not one freaking scientific review. So like wait for an amassing amount of literature and well done studies. And then I would also go from like different perspectives. So when we get into perspectival, there's like Zen Buddhism, there's different Kriya yogas and stuff where they do all sorts of meditation practice. The list goes on. You can find so many different ways of like how to meditate in these different approaches. And I think you need to diversify knowledge. I'm huge on diversity. I think a rule of life is like monotony kills and diversity thrives. It's like diversity in everything is really key. So I would just get a host of knowledge from different perspectives, both experiential and propositional is kind of what I'm saying.